There's a ship rotting in the middle of the ocean. No power, no engine that runs, massive holes torn through its hull, big enough to walk through, with the sea sloshing in and out with the tide. And living inside it, right now, are 9 to 12 people. Marines, sleeping in a rusted shell of a warship that's been dying since before their parents were born. They weren't stranded there, they were sent there on purpose. And if they ever leave, a war might start.
That's not a movie plot. That's happening today, on a reef most people couldn't find on a map. And by the end of this, you'll understand why a 1944 shipwreck might be the thing that finally pulls two superpowers into a shooting war. So let's start with what's actually there. The reef is called Second Thomas Shoal. The Philippines calls it Ayungin. China calls it Ren'ai Jiao. Same rock, 3 names. That alone tells you something.
It sits about 105 nautical miles off the Philippine island of Palawan, well inside what international law calls the Philippines Economic Zone. Under the law of the sea, it's what's known as a low tide elevation. At high tide, it vanishes underwater completely, which means legally nobody can actually own it.
But you can still sit on it. And in 1999, that's exactly what the Philippines did, deliberately running an old Navy ship aground on the reef to plant a flag the tides couldn't wash away. That ship became the BRP Sierra Madre. It's still there. Here's what most people don't know about that ship. It wasn't built for this. It wasn't even built for the Philippines. It rolled off an American shipyard in Indiana in 1944, built to land tanks on beaches during World War II. It went on to patrol rivers during the Vietnam War. Then, in April 1975, as Saigon fell, that same ship, under a different flag, became a lifeboat. Over 3,000 terrified South Vietnamese refugees packed onto its deck as it fled toward open sea. It escaped one collapsing country only to be handed to another. The United States gave the ship to the Philippines. 24 years later, Manila ran it aground on purpose to block a rising China from taking the same reef. A ship that once escaped communism is now the thing standing in China's way. Let that sink in for a second. Today, a rotating handful of Philippine Marines call that hull home. They sleep in a ship that leaks. They eat out of a kitchen floating on borrowed time. And just outside their window, day after day, sit Chinese Coast Guard cutters, steel-hulled, modern, enormous, circling the water around them. China doesn't call this a blockade. It calls it managing its own waters. Researchers call it something else, gray zone warfare. Pressure applied just below the line that counts as an actual attack. Water cannons, blinding lasers, fishing boats that aren't really fishing boats, a trained militia dressed as civilians, doing the Navy's job without ever calling it the Navy. In 2021, about 1 Chinese ship watched that reef. By 2023, that number passed 13. On one day that December, 46 Chinese vessels surrounded 4 Filipino ones. And then it turned physical. In June 2024, Chinese Coast Guard crews boarded Philippine boats carrying knives and axes. The Filipino sailors had strict orders, no firearms, no matter what. So they fought back with their bare hands. One of them lost a thumb. 2 years later, in July 2026, it happened again. A wooden baton swung hard enough to cause serious head trauma. Now think about what that actually means, beyond that reef. This isn't some remote squabble over a rock nobody's heard of. Over $5 trillion in trade sails through these waters every year, a huge share of it American. The phone in your pocket, the fuel in your car, the goods on the shelf at your store, some of it crossed this exact stretch of ocean to reach you. If this blockade tips into war, it doesn't stay a local story. It reaches your gas prices and your grocery bill faster than you'd think. And here's the part that should really stop you. Those sailors getting hit with knives and batons were under direct orders not to fight back with weapons. Ask yourself, if you were on that boat, unarmed, watching an axe come toward you, knowing your country was counting on you not to fire the first shot, what would you have done? There's an old saying inside China's own military about this exact standoff. Strike the rat, but spare the vase. They want the outpost gone, but they can't afford to actually kill a Filipino sailor, because the Philippines has a decades-old defense treaty with the United States, and a death on that ship could be the trigger that pulls Washington straight into the fight. So both sides keep circling, testing how far they can push without crossing that one final line. Meanwhile, back in Manila, the pressure isn't only military. In 2026, a separate global energy crisis hit the Philippines hard enough that its own president floated jointly developing gas fields with the very country blockading his marines. Sovereignty and survival pulling in opposite directions. Somewhere out on that reef right now, a handful of young Marines are still there, watching the horizon, watching the same gray ships they watched yesterday and the day before that. Nobody back home hears about most of it. No headlines, no cameras. Just a rusting hull, holding a line the rest of the world barely notices. Until, one day, it can't hold anymore.
That's the quiet part nobody tells you about power. It isn't always loud. Sometimes it's just a dozen people, alone on a sinking ship, deciding every single day not to leave. If stories like this, the ones hiding just under the headlines, are the kind of thing you want more of, consider subscribing. There's a lot more history quietly shaping the present than most people realize.